Thank you very much, and it is such a pleasure to be here. I should just also let you know I retired from JNU 3 years ago. But anyway, I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you for inviting me. Well, actually, I'm delighted that India exists. Not just the country, India. I think it was essential, it was necessary, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you who have had the intelligence and the wisdom to actually come together at a time when I think everyone in this room, we all know why we all feel desperate, why we all feel that this country is going in a direction that we never anticipated could move so quickly that way. And we all know that we have to actually come together to stop that, right? So I'm very happy and very honored that you invited me to be part of this. And we've heard many wonderful speeches and very inspiring and very important speeches. So, and I know that already many people are here who are going to have lots to say. So I'm going to try and keep it brief. I'm going to talk really about one aspect which has been touched on, but it's actually a huge problem. And I think we don't recognize the extent to which this is such a danger to our polity, not just for democracy, but actually for the very survival of the nation. I think there's a huge sense in which India cannot exist unless it remains very federal. And for many reasons, language has been talked about, social justice has been talked about, the massive variety that is in India. All of that, of course, requires a much more federal structure. But also the Constitution was very wise because, in fact, it recognized that state governments are the ones where actually the citizen relates the most. In other words, the rights of citizens were dominantly expressed through state governments. All of these essential things, health, education, security, all of these things were the domain of state governments. Agriculture, these were all, so in fact, the sort of first port of call, the space in which citizenship was established, that was with the states. What's happened, particularly in the last decade, has been not just an erosion of that, but I would say a reversal of many of the possibilities of that. And that to me is terrifying because I do believe that for this nation to exist, it has to be federal. And I'm going to talk specifically on the economic parts of this. But just to highlight that, what we have seen, and it's also because of the shock and awe tactics of the current leadership, right, is that we get increasing centralization of policy making to the point where state governments are not, forget being consulted, they're not even informed, whether it's demonetization or it is the lockdown with 4 hours notice. There is massive centralization of decision-making, and yet there's decentralization of the responsibility. So it's the state governments who are left holding the baby, whether it is demonetization, or it is the lockdown, or it is all of the things which have terrific impact on the lives of citizens. It's the state governments that are left holding the baby. And yet when they're holding this baby, they have access to less and less of the government's resources. So we've had this simultaneous centralization of authority, decentralization of responsibility, and therefore of the burdens on state governments, with a massive reduction in their share of the fiscal resources. So when the BJP came into power, the Finance Commission just submitted its report in the first 6 months of its tenure, if you remember. And they did this remarkable thing of increasing the share of state governments of the tax revenues to 41%. And that was actually seen as a very significant shift because it recognizes that it's the state governments that are going to deal with all of these things. So you have to actually give them more of these resources, give it to them untied. Don't put everything only through centrally sponsored schemes that the center will decide exactly how they're implemented. Enable the state governments to do this. The BJP government actually accepted the recommendations, but then it used a loophole, which is effectively the ability to impose cesses and surcharges which are not shared. And this is really an anomaly. It was, I think, possibly an error that, it was seen. I think cesses and surcharges were seen as temporary devices for particular situations rather than something very regular. What this government has done over the last decade is dramatically increase the share of cesses and surcharges. In fact, almost all new taxes are these cesses and surcharges because those don't have to be shared. So as a result, these cesses and surcharges, they were about 10% of the total tax revenue in 2013. They are now 28% of total tax revenue. Almost 1/3 is just cesses and surcharges. The entire increase in tax revenues is really these things which are kept by the centre. So state governments today, instead of getting the 41%, that is what the Finance Commission actually awarded them, are getting in the range of 30%, 31%. In fact, the latest number that I looked at is just under 30% for the fiscal year that's just over. So there's a dramatic reduction in the revenues that the state government gets. And meanwhile, of course, GST has meant that you've given up all your revenue-raising powers. And so it's a much more complicated situation in terms of the basic fiscal ability of states to do things. The share of untied funds, therefore, it really means the combination of the centralization posed by the GST and the centre's very cynical grabbing of additional tax revenues through cesses and surcharges has meant that states are therefore less empowered to meet the needs of their citizens. And that gives much greater power to the centre because it can then politicize its relationship with the states. So that is the other thing that has happened. We heard Mr. Achari talk about how that works for the BJP-ruled states vis-a-vis other ruled states. But we are seeing this fiscally as well. We are seeing a weaponization of central transfers to state governments in a whole range of ways. It happens during disasters. A flood hits Kerala, cyclone hits West Bengal, they will not get the same relief that a lower degree of disaster will, a different state government led by, shall we say, a friendly party will get. So we are getting a weaponization of fiscal transfers, which again has huge implications. The BJP advertises this in the name of double-engine sarkar, but in fact it is a deep way of creating very, very worrying divisions within our polity that could have longer-term consequences and really could impede the unity of this nation. This is a political approach that has even been expressed in food grain distribution. As you know, when Karnataka announced its food grain scheme just after the Congress came to power in that state, the government decided that it was no longer going to make available that food grain for purchase by state governments. And it's now busy selling a large part of that food grain to private producers for ethanol because there aren't enough takers for it in the wheat market. So we are getting that degree of cynicism because of the fact that resources are more centralized and they are being weaponized, politicized in a way that was never the case before. I don't want to, as I said, you've heard so much and I don't want to spend too much time. I just want to make two more points. One has to do with, it's not just centralizing, but it's opacity. It is that more and more of the central government's actions are shrouded in not just secrecy, not just that they're unexpected, that there's shock and awe and so on, but that they are actually completely unknown to any of the citizens. I have been teaching in a university abroad recently, and when I mention something like electoral bonds, nobody actually believes me. They say, no, this can't happen. It's impossible. How can you have a system like that where nobody actually knows except the government in power which controls the banks that get these? How can that be? It cannot be. So we have electoral bonds. We had this extraordinary thing during the pandemic, PM Cares. We've let it go because every day some new thing happens and so we get used to this. Again, when I tried to explain PM Cares to people outside, they said, what? You set it up as something that was, we have a Prime Minister's Relief Fund, which is subject to public audit and everybody knows the accounts and so on. That was sidelined and PM Cares is set up ostensibly as an official thing where public servants were all giving one day's salary, where everybody was more or less press-ganged, coerced into donating for this fund. And yet it turns out it's a private fund. And nobody can find out how it's being spent. We're not allowed to know how it's being spent. Again, that this can happen at all, and that you would see PM Cares ads on ministry websites. I think until very recently they were still available. Is something which you cannot imagine in any other democratic nation. So when we keep saying we're the largest democracy, and so we still are, thank God. But it's it's fraying a lot, and it's fraying in many ways. It's fraying because also the simple barrage of things that are going wrong at different levels is so large that we kind of give up in terms of where to keep fighting. There are things going on as we speak in Parliament. I don't know what has been the fate of that terrible data bill. It's passed?
No.
Oh, it hasn't. Okay, I mean, there's a shred of hope that it hasn't yet passed. And similar things, but there is this onslaught, in fact, of every possible democratic institution. And of course, along with that opacity comes the broader opacity, which has already been mentioned, about data. We had one of the best statistical systems in the world. And as an Indian, I was really proud that India was actually giving lessons to a whole range of other countries. How do you actually collect data for an informal economy in which there is agriculture, there's seasonality, and all of these things? We had such a wonderful statistical system. It had its limitations, but nonetheless, it was very actually something to be proud of. And it's disappeared. We have actually managed to kill it in these 9 years. So whether it is poverty data, we have no idea about poverty because we have not done a consumer expenditure survey. We did one in 2017-18. They didn't like it because the leaked document tells us that rural consumption had actually fallen and clearly rural poverty had gone up. So they junked it. And they said, no, the methodology was wrong, etc., etc. They refused to release it, even though everything had been approved. The printed copies were all there. Okay, they all had to be shredded. And since then, they haven't had a consumer expenditure survey. Can you imagine? Our last data for consumption expenditure for any assessment of poverty is 2011-12. More than a decade ago. We have absolutely no idea about what has happened. We are the only country in the world that hasn't had a census yet after the pandemic. And imagine a country where you're trying to govern and you don't even know how many people there are, or where they are, or what they do, or how many men or women or whatever, and how old they are. You have no idea. You are guessing, you're stabbing in the dark for the most basic information of governing. And this is, by the way, just as bad for state governments because they will not know either. In other words, state governments have to deal with the consequences of this complete inadequacy of data. A few data was still being allowed to be collected. The National Family Health Survey, they didn't like the latest one because it's shown that open defecation still exists. I don't know how they thought they could hide this fact when it's kind of evident. When you walk around, you know that it still exists. But they didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that it didn't show much improvement in child nutrition and so on and so forth. So they have gone after the poor gentleman who was in charge of these surveys. We are still getting labour force surveys. They are not good news for the government, so I'm waiting to see what happens to those and whether we will continue to get those. But we are basically seeing a massive attack on all of the essential institutions that you need to just be a country, to just have governments and just to have even parties or people or academics, anyone know what they're talking about. Because we do not have access to that data because it's being systematically destroyed or simply not collected. And then all kinds of ridiculous indexes are put together, like the Niti Aayog's latest multidimensional poverty index, which is so embarrassing that one I didn't even dare to tell my colleagues abroad because it's so laughable, this measure of multidimensional poverty that has been used. So all of these things really mean that if we have to save India, we really need India. And so, I wish I knew how to get there. I'm hoping that all of you sitting in the front row here have a better idea because we really honestly do need all of you. So thank you very much.